Hi, everyone, and welcome to a very special discussion with my dear friend, Professor Noah Feldman of Harvard Law School. Noah is a man of, like me, incredible humility. I say that because I just couldn't believe when this book came out. I had been speaking to Noah on a certain issue for weeks, and he did not even divulge to me that he had this powerful book that was in the works. And I actually found out about it in the New York Times book review. One Saturday, Shabbat afternoon, there it was on one of my favorite subjects, Lincoln, the Constitution, slavery. The book has been reviewed nationally everywhere, has gotten incredible reviews. It's called The Broken Constitution, Lincoln, Slavery, and the Refounding of America. It sparked a fascinating debate among scholars and lay people like myself about slavery and whether it was endemic to the Constitution, whether it was vital, central to the Constitution, and whether Lincoln had to, quote, break the Constitution in order to emancipate the slaves. Professor Noah Feldman of Harvard, thank you for joining us.
Shmuley, thank you so much for having me, and thank you for being so generous as to have me on your show.
You know, you didn't tell me that you had this book coming out. It's the craziest thing.
We were talking about other matters, you know, it was that we were on the subject we were on.
I mean, this is a major work of scholarship. Like, how long did it take you to write this?
Thank you for saying that. It took me about 3 years to write the book, and the research began a bit before that, but the writing took about 3 years from beginning to end. And it was a very personal and intense process for me because, as you know, I care a lot about the Constitution. And I think a lot of people in the country are asking questions that I was also asking myself. We know that a lot of our founders, including James Madison, whom I'd written a book about before, were slaveholders.
Very, very celebrated book, yeah.
But how much should we believe that the Constitution itself, a document that we revere and that we treat in many ways as a moral blueprint, how much should that Constitution be seen as being tainted by the presence of slavery at the founding? And like a lot of people, I've been struggling with that question. And this book was my attempt to answer that question for myself. And I actually was really surprised by a lot of the things that I learned in the process of the research. And that made it exciting to write it, but also a little scary because I was writing about the Constitution, not only in its idealized form, but it's in its real world form. And I was also writing about how one of our greatest presidents, some would say our greatest president, actually did break the Constitution as he understood it. And that's a remarkable and slightly frightening thought.
Well, to sum up, if I may, some of your important conclusions of the book, and this was seen in the academic community as almost like throwing a grenade in the public square. You say a lot of things that are very thought-provoking, and you're kind of attacking a lot of sacred cows. First and foremost, you essentially say that Lincoln decided that he had no choice but to become a dictator during the Civil War by suspending the writ of habeas corpus and suspending press freedoms and arresting some 25,000 Americans without trial. The second thing, and then we'll go through them one by one. The second thing, of course, is that you essentially conclude that rather in the broken Constitution, that unlike some other scholars who believe that the Constitution was trying to slowly phase out slavery through these various compromises, but it was a document that would lead to the dissolution of slavery. You don't believe that that's the case. You believe that, which leads us to the third conclusion, that Lincoln actually had to kind of move away from the Constitution and create a moral Constitution in order to emancipate the slaves. So let's just go through those things one by one. Lincoln is our greatest president. His reputation is already kind of under attack, given that he kind of never really believed that blacks and whites were equals. He had a great relationship with Frederick Douglass. You know, of course, he emancipated the slaves, but he's already under attack. Some people are even trying to cancel him. Now you add this thing that he is a dictator. Do you mean that in a very derogatory way or in a necessary way?
Well, I'm trying to define it as neutrally as I can using terminology that he himself used. You know, it's always an interesting question when you're doing a historical analysis. You know, when you say dictator, what dictator are you picturing? And so a lot of it depends on the context that you provide. I'm trying to provide the context that Lincoln himself operated under. So I'll give you just a concrete example. Just a few months after he became president, when the war had started, one of his generals, John C. Fremont, who had actually been the Republican candidate for the presidency in 1856, 4 years before Lincoln, who had been made a general, began to free the slaves of people in his district in Missouri, whom he believed to be loyal to the Confederacy. And Lincoln wrote him a letter saying, stop. And Fremont said, no, I'm not going to stop. You have to make me. And Lincoln said, okay, you're fired. And Lincoln reversed his emancipation orders. And then Lincoln wrote a letter dated September 22nd, 1861, a year to the day before he announced a draft of what would become the Emancipation Proclamation, to a friend of his, an Illinois politician called Orville Browning, where he said for a general or the president to free enslaved people just on his own say-so, based on the belief that their owners or their masters were loyal to the Confederacy, is dictatorship. That's Lincoln's own word. And that was actually not just a new view for Lincoln. It went all the way back to 1838, when he was a very young person, just entering politics, gave a famous speech at the Young Men's Lyceum in Springfield, Illinois, called the Lyceum Address. And in it, he said, it was a speech in defense of the rule of law. He said, we have to beware people like Alexander the Great, Julius Caesar, or Napoleon, that is to say, would-be dictators, who would stop at nothing to become great figures in history, whether that was freeing slaves or enslaving free men. And he didn't mean that that was a good thing. So, Lincoln's long-held view was that an act of emancipation would be an act of dictatorship, again, by his own terms. And then a year after writing that letter to his friend, he did it. So that's the context in which I'm using the terminology.
Well, there was a book written, I think by Jonathan Alter, about whether FDR should have assumed dictatorial powers during the Second World War. And some people believe that he should have, given that it was the dictators who were winning the wars and democracies didn't seem able to compete with the dictatorships. Is it sometimes, and he chose not to, of course, is it sometimes maybe necessary? Did Lincoln do this because he had to? And are you trying to be an indifferent historical observer in declaring him to have been a dictator, or are you passing judgment?
I am going to try to pass judgment, and I guess I would break that into two parts. Sometimes it is necessary to engage in acts of dictatorship in wartime, and sometimes it isn't, and the hard part is knowing which is which. So in the book, I actually argue that Lincoln's choice to suspend the writ of habeas corpus on his own without Congress, which is not what the Constitution provides for, was an act of dictatorship that wasn't justified. It wasn't necessary. The Chief Justice of the Supreme Court at the time issued an opinion saying it was unconstitutional. And after the war, the Supreme Court held that the government cannot suspend people's fundamental rights and the operation of the courts in any part of the country which is not itself at war. So both in Lincoln's lifetime and afterwards and after the war, the consensus among constitutional experts was that Lincoln went too far. So that, in my view, is a case where he went too far in becoming a dictator. But when it comes to the emancipation of enslaved people, I would argue that the Constitution that we had, the Constitution of 1787, was fundamentally based on a compromise with something that was immoral, namely slavery. And the only way to fix that at that time, with no opportunity for a constitutional amendment in the middle of the war, was to break it. And that was a moral act. It was also an act of dictatorship, but it was moral and it was justified. So, I want to say there are some circumstances where acting outside the Constitution is wrong and some where it's right. And we should be grown up enough to realize that it's possible to distinguish those things. So our conclusion shouldn't be that we have no judgment, and our conclusion shouldn't be that it's always bad to break the Constitution or that it's always okay to break the Constitution. It has to be very exceptional circumstances, and it has to be to break something that's fundamentally at the most deep structural level, rendering the country an immoral compromise. And that's what slavery was.
But in reading a lot of this book has been so widely reviewed in the top outlets in the world. In reading a lot of the reviewers, I think the reason why they're concerned about those two conclusions, that the Constitution was fundamentally flawed and needed to be broken, there was no choice, and second, that Lincoln, our greatest president, was a dictator, is that they're afraid for modern times. That right now, the only thing keeping this country together is the Constitution. It's pretty bad out there, the partisanship and the hatred between factions. And so it's the only thing kind of keeping us. And the second thing is that if it is true that even great men, and we all agree that Lincoln was a great man, need to assume dictatorial powers to get things done, people are really worried about that in the modern context as democracy slides around the world. Did you know that people would kind of see a modern residence and kind of be alarmed by that as you wrote the book?
I was worried about it too when I was writing the book. I mean, most of the research and writing of this book I did during the presidency of Donald J. Trump. And there was a lot of national disagreement about this, but I was one of the people who believed and even testified under oath that he had exceeded the powers of the presidency and should be impeached and removed from office. Now, he was impeached, he wasn't removed from office. So, the Senate had its say, and it wasn't the conclusion that I was advocating for. But the reality is that I was very concerned to not be read to be saying that a contemporary president would be justified in suspending the Constitution to achieve what he believed or she believed to be a moral end. The circumstances I'm talking about are really unique circumstances. First, that the Constitution as it existed was dependent on an immoral structure. And I do not believe that that is the case today. I do not believe that our Constitution, now that it doesn't have slavery in it, now that there's the 13th Amendment which bans slavery, the 14th Amendment which guarantees equal protection, and the 15th Amendment that enfranchises people regardless of color, I don't believe our Constitution is fundamentally immoral now, and so it wouldn't be justified to break it. And we're not in the presence of a full-on constitutional rebellion as we were at the time when Southern states seceded from the Union. We have a lot of loose talk about how things are so bad that we should secede. And on January 6th, there were some people who were interested in changing the outcome of the election by force, which is very unfortunate. But that falls short of being the full-on war or rebellion that would justify the most extreme actions and circumstances to save the Union. So I don't think that a contemporary president has almost any odds of confronting the same things. And I myself would be, I hope, a strong supporter of the rule of law and of not breaking the Constitution as it exists today. But sometimes when you tell a historical narrative, it's necessary to be truthful about it, even if it could potentially be misused. And so I agree with you, Shmuley, that some reviewers are worried about how the argument could be used. But I think when you tell history, it should be usable, it should be relevant. I hope this is both of those things, but it should also be honest. And I don't believe in putting a thumb on the historical record to produce a result that I want to reach.
You are that rare academic of great standing who also comments regularly on current events. You're not just looking at the law, you're not just looking at the Constitution. People look to you for guidance in contemporary matters. If it's true that there is a moral law that rises above the Constitution, which was kind of the argument that the abolitionists always made, right? That there was this,
Yes, there was.
this moral law. Now, if you personally believe that as a very noted constitutional authority, then we're looking at, I don't know, not that I want to get sidetracked with this, but take abortion, for example, which is now being debated, and the court is going to render a ruling on Texas. And a lot of people would say that that moral law rises above the Constitution, as well, or any court ruling. Like, where does it end that we say that the Constitution is the law of the land versus a moral law which actually supersedes? I mean, that speaks to kind of a religious person like me, but does it speak to a sound future for the United States?
Well, I think there are two issues here. The first is, what's the oath you take when you take an oath to support the Constitution of the United States, the way judges do, or the way politicians do, or the way, someone who serves in the military or in the government does. And the second question is, when is it appropriate to break that oath? So with respect to that oath, I think you're taking an oath to obey the Constitution as you and the courts interpret it. And ultimately, it's the courts in our system who have the last say on what that means. And if you feel you must break the Constitution or that the Constitution is immoral, you should resign from office and not perform your job if your job would make you do something immoral. So for example, let's say you're a believing Catholic and you believe the death penalty is immoral under effectively all circumstances, and you're put in a position of being on a jury or even being a judge required to sentence someone to the death penalty. You can't sentence them to the death penalty consistent with your moral proposition. You should resign from your position rather than violate your moral principles. But if you're in the job, you shouldn't be governed by your moral principles that are outside the Constitution. You should be governed by the Constitution because that's what you swore your oath to obey. Now, there's a separate question of whether your interpretation of the Constitution should include some component of morality. My own view is that almost all interpretations of the Constitution require some degree of moral judgment. And that's one reason we don't all agree on what the Constitution should mean. But I think ultimately, you're supposed to be interpreting the Constitution, and you might do so in the light of your own morality, but you're not supposed to be breaking the Constitution with your own morality, provided you're in that job. That said, Shmuley, I think you and I, and essentially anyone who's committed to a picture of morality that is divine or that is greater than the judgment of individual humans, has to have the view that the law is not inherently moral. The
Well,
law is just the law. And if the law violates core principles of morality, we need to be able to say so. Just because Congress has passed a law or just because people have enacted into the Constitution doesn't make it morally right.
I'm hoping that your book will continue to spark this national conversation that you and I are having right now, because I feel that if we were able to zero in on this core issue about there being a right and a wrong that kind of transcends Constitution, party, of course, politics, then we might find some common ground, because values of right and wrong are where people actually meet. Right now, we're using the Constitution to bludgeon each other, and but it is a slippery slope. Noach, if you do have a moral law that rises above the Constitution, you are relegating the Constitution to a secondary status. And your point that not necessarily, because a person who believes in a higher moral law, I don't know, a Catholic like Biden can resign the presidency rather than, allow abortion. But that's not always the case. There will be great moral conundrums where it would be a dereliction of leadership if you were to resign. If Lincoln had resigned in the middle of the Civil War because he didn't want to break the Constitution and left the Union armies adrift and left all the slaves in chains, he'd be considered, history would have judged him very harshly. He had no choice.
Yeah, that would have been morally wrong.
Based on how you analyze this in the book, he had to kind of break the Constitution, and he had to assume these dictatorial powers, because you seem alarmed by what he did. Am I wrong?
Well, you're not wrong. In many instances, or in several instances, he went too far in doing that. Once you appoint yourself person who can break the Constitution, it's hard to block you. And you can do things that go too far, like the suspension of habeas corpus. But you can also do things that are morally necessary, as was the case, in my view, for emancipation. So there's no magic solution to that problem. There's no escape from practical fundamental judgment. When it comes to our national debates, though, what we should be doing is trying to have a rational, calm argument about what we think the Constitution is best interpreted to mean. And at our best, we do manage that. And in that argument, the punchline should never be, my faith teaches me X, so I win the argument. Because whatever your particular faith is, it's not incarnated into the Constitution. The Constitution doesn't incorporate one particular religious or moral point of view. The debate then should be about how should we interpret the words of the Constitution in the light of the moral principles that we hold most dear. And ideally, that should enable us to have a national conversation. Sometimes it does seem like we're bludgeoning ourselves with the Constitution, but that is sometimes better than just a raw debate, which says, I'm right, you're wrong, let's split up. My aspiration is for all Americans to realize that the other people, the people you don't agree with, are trying by their best lights to interpret the Constitution rightly and to give each other a little bit of credit, even in cases where we deeply disagree with each other. My fear is that we've entered a world where lots of people think that their interpretation of the Constitution is just fundamentally correct, and that the people on the other side are bad people.
Right.
And that scares me, because you can't really run a democracy in the long run if you believe that the other half of the people, and they're roughly half on each side, ballpark, are bad people, because they're supposed to be your fellow citizens that you're going to act alongside of. You can think they're wrong about something. You can think that they're misguided. You can think you need to vote them out of office. You can even think you need to convince them of a different point of view. But if you think they're bad people, the game is up. You can't possibly live together.
I completely agree with you. As an aside, I just published my book, Kosher Hate. And one of the arguments I make, without going into whether hate is a good thing or not, I argue for hating evil. But when you don't have kosher hate, you end up having unkosher hate. All the hatred we have in America today, it's so unkosher. We hate people, they're not evil, they're not terrorists, they're not genocidaires. We just hate them because they disagree with us. It's quite astonishing. Let's come back to your book. Again, I want to reemphasize Broken Constitution. Noach, I don't know how I can forgive you, because you wrote a book about three of my favorite subjects all rolled into one, and you didn't tell me you were writing this book.
I'm sorry. I try not to. I know you had your own book coming out.
I love Lincoln.
And my book didn't have the word kosher in the title. I should have called it Kosher Lincoln, and then I could have incorporated into the Shmuley Boteach kosher franchise.
Pantheon, right? Well, you know what? Let's talk about.
Maybe you should write that, Shmuley. Maybe you should write a book, Kosher Lincoln.
Noach, if I had your academic,
I think of worse titles.
Let's talk about Kosher Lincoln. So, what's really fascinating about your book is the personality of Abraham Lincoln. now a subject of endless debate. We've debated whether Lincoln was gay with Joshua Speed. We've debated whether he was like on the verge of suicide every single day in Lincoln's Melancholy. We've debated whether he was a racist, whether he was an emancipator, a great man. We've never really debated whether he was a dictator. And that's why I find your book so interesting. I always felt that the historical record was that he employed dictatorial powers that were never questioned by historians because they were that essential, because you had a full-on rebellion. Does Lincoln emerge diminished in your?
I don't think so. I mean, I don't think so. So first of all, I will just say Lincoln's exercise these powers was intensely questioned, including in his lifetime, including by people who supported him. So the Emancipation Proclamation was attacked by a former Supreme Court justice at the time who was a Northern man, a Harvard College graduate, a Harvard Law School graduate, hated slavery, and said, this is ridiculous. Lincoln has just gone off the rails. So it was intensely criticized even at the time. I will say that to me, I ended up admiring Lincoln much more after writing the book than I did to begin with, because if you see Lincoln's actions as president as the natural outgrowth of his whole life's approach and values, then that's fine, but it's not especially extraordinary. It just implies that it was all baked in advance. But if you see, as I do, that Lincoln was deeply committed to the rule of law, that he thought the rule of law meant following the Constitution, that he was a compromised person his whole life, a supporter of the Whig Party, which was the party of compromise, and that even in his first inaugural address, which we never hear about, we hear about his second inaugural address, we hear about the Gettysburg Address, those are both on the Lincoln Memorial walls. We never hear about his first inaugural address, because in that inaugural address, he started out his presidency by saying, slavery is protected by the Constitution. I have no desire to change it. I have no authority to change it. Just a year and a half before he did all of that. So, or a little more than a year and a half before he did all of that. So I'm much more impressed by Lincoln by seeing him changing in real time, by seeing him shifting his view in light of his recognition, not only of necessity, but of the fundamental immorality of the compromise he had supported his whole life. That's growth, that's change, that's transformation. And to me, that's greatness. It's more great that he took exactly the thing that he said would make someone a great man and a bad president, namely freeing slaves, and he did it. That's much greater than if that had been his aspiration or his plan the entire time. So I am more impressed by Lincoln. And I think it's also really hard to do the morally right thing when you spend your whole life telling yourself that you shouldn't. And that's what Lincoln did. And it's also impressive that he was able to do the right thing, even under circumstances where his own beliefs told him that he shouldn't.
Going back 30 years, you and I have had many conversations about Judaism. You're a scholar of Jewish texts, as you are of America's great legal documents. And we've had fascinating conversations. And one of the things we've always talked about is that Judaism does believe in this idea of struggle, the Yisrael, he who wrestles and struggles, as opposed to the Washington, the marble man. We're now beginning to humanize so many of our founding fathers. Some people don't like that. A lot of them are being canceled as a result of that humanization. Maybe it's just easier to see people as monoliths and not have to look at their darker side. I appreciate what you're saying, that there are things that you can't compromise on. And I guess that's something that Lincoln just did not understand. He was a politician in the final analysis.
Yeah.
And he did have to kind of hold on to the country, but the question was at what expense? I even prefer, as you just said, a Lincoln who wrestles and struggles as opposed to someone who's perfect. Although I have to say, the strange thing about Abraham Lincoln is that we've scoured his entire life and we haven't really found a lot of scandal. The money his wife would spend on, improvements at the White House, he would repay. There's no financial scandal. There's no sexual scandal. It's almost like we're trying to find, in some ways, he was a saintly figure. I mean, am I wrong that kosher Lincoln? It's okay to grow. I get back to the personality of Lincoln. I really want to know what you finally conclude about this guy.
Yeah.
Because I'm not sure his name is going to last on high schools.
So let me say two things about this. So first, I really like your insight, Shmuley, about the struggling Lincoln. Like you, I am very attracted to, and with you, I'm attracted to the idea of great people of history who struggle. And I actually think a lot of that probably does have to do with growing up, caring about and reading and continuing to study the figures of the Bible who are not depicted in every case as utterly pure. I mean, Jacob, the one who struggles with the angel and gets the name Israel, is a person who has personal struggles as described in the Bible. And although the rabbis bend over backwards to try to cleanse, a great forefather, a great a great righteous man of any blame, the literal meaning of the biblical text of the book of Genesis shows you all kinds of questionable things that Jacob does. Not as much that's less true for Abraham, although even Abraham has some missteps, which he gets in trouble with other people and with God and with his wife for. So, that tradition that says, that version of the Jewish tradition that says that are even the people whom we consider most holy are people who really struggle and do things wrong, and that even to include Moses, is a strand of Jewish tradition. Not that every Jewish tradition believes this, but it's a strand of Jewish tradition that I'm very drawn to. And I think it probably does have something to do with how I think about people like Lincoln or the founders. I think it's fine for us to look up to somebody, even if that person turns out to be human. Now, with respect to Lincoln himself, I don't see Lincoln as a saintly figure. I do agree with you that there's nothing that he did in his life that seems outrageously immoral. I agree with that. And unlike, Madison, he didn't own slaves. Unlike some other great presidents, he wasn't involved necessarily in other forms of scandalous behavior at a personal level. That said, he was a politician. He was ambitious to succeed in politics. When he was younger, he was very ambivalent in his personal relationships. He was back and forth about whether he should get married and how. It's not clear that he treated everyone they didn't use the word dated at the time, but we would say dated, that he treated them all so wonderfully in that context. He wasn't a saint. He was a human being, and in certain senses, an ordinary one. I mean, I show him in the book, among other things, for political reasons, after he's decided to issue the Emancipation Proclamation, trying to reassure white people that it doesn't mean that blacks and whites are going to live next to each other, by calling a group of African Americans, prominent ones from Washington, D.C., into his office and lecturing them and telling them that the war is their fault, that it's because of black people that white people are killing each other, which Frederick Douglass at the time said this was the most repugnant thing he'd ever heard. And he's right. You read it and you realize, and Lincoln did it for political reasons. So he was a politician. I don't think he was a saint. That said, he did the right thing when he absolutely had to. And then he was martyred. And so from that standpoint, I think we can justifiably treat him as a hero. And if you look at the Lincoln Memorial, he's enshrined there as a god. The Lincoln Monument is based on an Athenian temple. It's built like an Athenian temple, and he's enshrined there. And to the extent, as a secular matter, we can have heroes whom we enshrine like that, I think it's appropriate to put Lincoln there. But that doesn't mean he was a perfect man. I don't think he was.
Let me ask you a final question, Noach, and well said about Lincoln. Now that we do have these constitutional amendments, would you say that the Constitution no longer needs to be broken?
Right now, I don't think our Constitution needs to be broken. I think that our Constitution lays out a desirable moral ideal of equality and liberty and rights for everybody. What I would say is that a legal promise of equality, which is what the Constitution gives us, isn't the same as delivering actual real world equality. For a simple reason. If you live in a capitalist system, which we do, and I'm a capitalist, you understand that if two people have different inputs, they get different outcomes. So if you have $1,000 and I have $100, and we make the exact same investment decisions, at the end of it, you'll have 10 times more than I will. We didn't put the same amount in, we're not going to get the same amount out. So for capitalism to deliver relatively fair and equal outcomes, people have to have roughly similar inputs. And that's true of education, and it's true of resources. And because of the legacy of slavery and segregation and other kinds of racial injustice, we don't have a society where everybody starts with roughly the same inputs. And so that's why we have a society where in practice, we have a lot of inequality, and a lot of that is inequality based on race. And that would be true even if no living person were consciously a racist because of the nature of a capitalist system. So for that reason, I don't think our Constitution needs to be broken, but I do think that as a matter of policy and law, there are things we can do to try to level our playing field in our country just to make it a little bit fairer. And I'm in favor of that because I am someone who's committed to democratic capitalism. And I think in order to preserve that kind of a structure, you do need to give people something like a fair shot at success in life.
Noach, you've already distinguished yourself as one of the world's great legal minds, especially going back to your early 30s when you helped to formulate the Iraqi constitution. But with this book, you continue this legacy of being one of America's most successful popularizers of what could often be obtuse legal subjects. This is so readable. It's so accessible. It's so powerful. It's a triumph. And people should really read it. If you love Lincoln, if you want to know things that parallels to our time, where democracy needs to sometimes, I don't know, allow for someone to fiddle with it a little bit in moments of great emergency, the great moral questions of our time. This is a phenomenal book, Broken Constitution by Professor Noach Feldman. Noach, you've been my friend for more than 3 decades. I'm so proud of you. You continue to churn out these books that are so relevant and are so thought-provoking and so important for the history of our nation. And I just wish you continued success and a belated Happy Hanukkah.
Thank you very much, Shmuley. Happy Hanukkah to you. Good luck on your latest book. And maybe we should collaborate on the Kosher Founding Fathers.
Well, the Kosher Lincoln, at least we know the name of this podcast.
There you go. Perfect. That's the right title. Be well.
Thank you, Noach.